we've reached a point, almost like we're going back to before the Civil War, where these differences are stark, they are perilous, and the media is made that the only story there is. The network news only has one story: Trump.
This episode is sponsored by Headquarters, where Lorelle Media offices and produces this podcast. In our humble opinion, Headquarters is the best co-working office space in Houston. It's creative, affordable, and just plain fun to work here. Headquarters, located just east of downtown Houston. My guest today is someone who's extremely familiar to the Houston market, and is someone who has probably interviewed thousands and thousands of people during his illustrious career as a broadcast journalist, but just shared with me that this is the first time you've ever sat down for an interview.
I've never sat for an interview before.
Unbelievable.
I've answered interrogatories, online,
Yes.
or an email to people who are doing articles, but I've never sat for an interview.
Well,
and thank God it's you.
Well, Bill Balleza, ladies and gentlemen.
We worked together for so long.
I called him teasingly my ex-TV husband, because we were joined at the hip on the anchor desk at KPRC for many years.
Yeah.
And wow, we went through some really great times and some rocky times together. And it's so wonderful to have you here so we can just talk.
This is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. So, it's interesting because we've been obviously friends for a long time, and but it's interesting. I feel like there's so much that I still don't know about you, and I know that you grew up in San Antonio.
I did.
Right? Mm-hmm. And you had a stint in Viet Nam, which we will talk about later, and you came back and found your way into journalism. So give our audience a little bit more of color in terms of how that story unfolded.
I got out of the Marine Corps at the end of August of 1969, just as the semester was starting at San Antonio College, the junior college in San Antonio. Drove home and went to enroll in college and succeeded in doing that. And then the guidance counselor said, "What do you want to major in?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to major in something that requires as little math as possible." I'd flunked Algebra 1 twice in high school. Only passed Algebra 2 in summer school because the teacher said, "Your daddy paid $35 for the course, so you're going to pass." Horrible at that kind of general math, great, but not. So she said, "We have a broadcasting program here that has no math requirement." I said, "Great, I'll take that." She said, "But you realize there's no one of your ethnicity working in the medium." And there weren't. In 1969, there were no Hispanics, no blacks, no women in broadcasting. But I said, "You know what? I'm on the GI Bill. I need a degree. That's all I need. So I'm not concerned about it." But then, when you start in college, immediately some people like us just fall in love with it.
Yeah.
So I was determined to get a job, and I walking to my apartment from school each day, I had to go right by KSAT, the ABC affiliate in San Antonio. Mm-hmm. One day I went in there and I said, "I'd like to apply for a job." And the receptionist said, "Well, okay." She gave me an employment application. And when I filled it in, the program director walked in. His name was Clyde Formby. And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm applying for a job." He said, "What can you do?" I said, "Nothing. I just started school. I just got out of the Marine Corps." He said, "You were in the Marine Corps?" He had been too in World War II. So we go to his office. We talk for an hour and a half. He hired me for the floor crew there. I was my first job was $2.50 an hour, operating one of those big studio floor cameras. Couldn't get in the news department in the 2 years I worked there, always on the floor crew. But then in 1971, when I was graduating from there, I had a scholarship to Trinity University to finish the last 2 years. But that's when all these community groups began challenging television station licenses based on their hiring practices. Because they're licensed by the federal government, they have to follow the Civil Rights Act of 1964, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And so they began looking for qualified Hispanics, blacks, women, but there weren't any because we'd been discouraged from studying it. So I suddenly started getting calls from everywhere. And then, of course, KSAT wanted to hire me in their two-person news department. No thanks. So I went to San Francisco. I started at KPRC-TV in 1971.
Unbelievable.
As a television reporter. I wasn't a television reporter, of course. You know how this works.
So just for those of you who don't understand how the business works, today to start in San Francisco as your first job would be like unheard of.
Oh yeah,
because
totally.
because it's considered a major market. What is it, like 5 or 6 or
Probably.
something? Yeah.
And at the time it was probably 4th.
Yeah. So typically you start in a very small town and you work your way up to get to a big market. Houston is market number 9 now, is it not?
I think it's 8.
Is it 8?
now.
Is it 8 now?
Yeah.
Yeah, gosh. So so for you to start in San Francisco is amazing. But because it was the times.
I was 23 years old.
Yeah.
The next youngest reporter was 31. Mike Mills. I don't know if you remember Mike.
No,
And
I don't.
And you know, he took me under his wing and taught me how to write copy. And there was a lot of resistance to my hiring. But people were angry, the reporters, photographers, and anchors, because I was coming in with no experience at a market where they had 10, 15, 20 years experience and worked hard to get there.
How did you handle that?
It was really difficult because it was, you know how it was, but you know, back, we're talking, what, 48 years ago now. People were pretty upfront about when they weren't happy. Women were treated terribly in the beginning, so were minorities. And so we would say, like one time, somebody said, "What do you know about film?" It was the days of film. I said, I was about to answer, and somebody said, "The only film he knows about is the film on his teeth." I mean, that's how it was.
Whoa.
So I get sent on my first story, and it was an art car in Berkeley. So we're crossing the Bay Bridge, and I had my photographer and sound man, Norm Bradley photographer, Lou Dilatori sound man, said, "Look, you don't know anything about this." I said, "You know what? If this even happens, it's going to be because of you guys." And Norm said, "We'll take care of you, kid." And I found out right then, when you make friends with the crew,
Yep.
good things start to
Good
happen
things
for
happen.
you.
Right.
And I learned an important lesson that day, to always be humble and always rely on the crew.
I could not agree with you more. When I started in the business, I remember always saying to my photographer, "This story is as much yours as it is mine.
Yes.
I don't feel as though I know everything, so I'm relying on you to bring your expertise to the table. You know, be my eyes and ears on that side of the camera, and let's make this story shine together."
Absolutely.
And when you approach it that way, you're going to get a much better product at the end.
Yes. When you defer to the photographer,
Yeah.
good things happen.
Yeah.
They don't like to be thought of as just functionaries in
Right.
the
Well, there's
process.
so much more than that.
Absolutely.
I mean, it doesn't happen without them.
No, that's right.
It does not happen without
Same
them.
with the editor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when did you notice that things started to get a little bit better in terms of acceptance of minorities and women in the industry as you progressed through your career?
It was, so this was 71 when I started. It came to Houston in 73. Houston was and please forgive me, but we were a total backwater, Houston, Texas. The police dispatchers, who were civilians, were using the N-word on the police dispatch radio. The police chief at the time would use the N-word in off the record talking to reporters on the 4th floor of 51 Reasoner, his office. It was really a backwards time. So minorities in general were having a really tough time integrating. And to the extent that it's happened, and you know what's happened to Houston in the last, since 46 years since I got here, is because of the media, the news media. We have led the way to complete integration and acceptance and tolerance in this town because we forced it. You know, and it happens even today.
So when you say we forced it, what do you mean by that?
By exposing what we were, and by giving people a voice, and by making sure that, you know, through the power of our medium, we were inclusive. It wasn't just, you know, I don't know if when you started, we'd go out to do stories. We wouldn't interview blacks and Hispanics, and we'd interview white people because they were the ones who mattered, and that's who. I remember one time I was doing an interview with then Mayor Louis Welch, first mayor when I was here, and it was 1973, and the Vietnamese boat people were starting to arrive in Houston, and there were only 2 public housing projects here. One of them was Allen Parkway Village, right next to KHOU, where I was working, and they were displacing the African Americans who lived there, and so there was a big brouhaha about that. So I went to him and I said, why don't we have more federal housing? I'd already checked, and HUD was offering money for these things. He said, well, he said, you know, Bill, the thing you have to understand is when you get federal money, there are strings attached to that. If we accept federal money to build more public housing, they will control it and we'll become another black city like Atlanta. He said this to me on film. I go back and I made the mistake of telling my news director, Dick John, what I had, and he said, you can't use that, it's too inflammatory. He would not allow me to use the soundbite.
Wow.
That's how we protected this
yeah.
whole thing.
Yeah.
But generally over time, more enlightened leadership came into the business, and we began to do exactly what we do today if a mayor were to say that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he wouldn't be protected.
No.
He or she would not be protected.
Were you here
saying
when
something
Jim
like that.
Westmoreland, who was on city council, reacted to the naming of the new Terminal E at Bush Intercontinental? We were going to call it Mickey Leland. Well, this upset him and a lot of white folks in town. So he said, we might as well just call it N-Word International. Do you remember that story?
No.
You can Google it. It's
oh my
right there,
gosh.
Jim Westmoreland. Well, we jumped on that with both feet, all the media, the newspaper. He had said it in the presence of a newspaper reporter. Then everybody jumped on it, and I think that was the turning point. And it wasn't until the 80s that this happened. And he didn't resign right away, but eventually he was not reelected.
So it's so interesting to get your perspective on how things have changed and progressed through the years. And I'm curious about how you feel about where we are now in terms of the divide that is happening in the country, as well as the media's role, if you will, in that divide. And I'll just leave it at that and ask for your thoughts.
You know, that is a really inflammatory topic, because you know what the Trump presidency has revealed is that there are 2 Americas. There is a liberal, forward-thinking America and a very conservative, we want it to stay the way it is America. And those 2, you know, that's always been there, but it had never been as apparent as it is now. So, I mean, we've reached a point almost like where we're going back to before the Civil War, where these differences are stark, they are perilous, and you know, the media is made that the only story there is. The network news only has one story, Trump. And the only thing, the thing I will say is this: the national news media has lost all sense of objectivity when it comes to this president and this administration, justifying it by saying, well, the guy shouldn't be there, and he's a detriment to our society and our country, and so therefore it doesn't matter, we can be as subjective as we want. And I always think there's room for a CNN and a Fox, but now everyone's joined the fray, and I hate to see us lose that objectivity. I can understand why it's happened, but I don't think there's any going back. People now see that the news media is not objective anymore, that network news was used to being the fourth estate. They had a seat at the table. They could go on the white, you know, they were part of governance in this country. They're not anymore, and they're very upset about it.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much there in what you said, and I agree with most of what you said. I do think that when, like you say, when there were 3 television networks, okay, back in the day, ABC, CBS, NBC, before the advent of CNN, and before the advent of Fox News.
Yeah.
There are those who would say that those 3 networks were also biased.
Oh yeah, that's true.
There are those who would say that. I tend to think that the 3 networks before the advent of the individual networks, the bigger ones, I mean CNN and Fox, et cetera, that there was much more objectivity to the news at that point. Media journalists at that time were more observers. They were more about holding power to account.
Yes.
It was not about opinion, and there was such a clear line and distinction between news and opinion.
Yes.
And even when I went to graduate school to study broadcast journalism,
At the best place, yeah.
Thank you. I happen to think so. So I was in graduate school in 1986 and 1987, and I was taught at University of Missouri Columbia in the Edward R. Murrow School of Journalism, which was very middle of the road. Here are the facts. You make up your mind about what you believe.
You the viewer.
You
Yes.
the viewer it's not about me and my opinion. And I used to say when I was on the air here for so many years with you, I had people in the community who would come up to me and say, oh, I know you're a Democrat. And then I would have others come up to me and say, oh, I know you're a Republican.
Yes.
And I was like, that's exactly the way I want it. Because it doesn't matter what my political point of view is. If I'm the journalist, I'm not supposed to be injecting my point of view into any story that I deliver.
Correct.
Okay? It's
Yes.
These are the facts. This is what this side says. This is what this side says. Now you make up your mind, and it shouldn't be about what I think, because that's not my role. All of that has just blown out of the water. It's completely upended everything.
Right.
And as a result, we can't even agree on the facts now. So where do we go from here, Bill? I'm asking you. Please give us an answer.
I think we've reached a tipping point, and
Oh
I
my
don't think we
gosh.
will ever have the credibility that we once enjoyed. Because now people, so to your point, when people say, well, you're a Democrat, but you're a Republican, because they sit there and they listen to everything through the filter of their own
Right, point
thought.
of view.
Yes. And so if you give the other side, they're going to say, oh my gosh, she's the other side. And you give that, well, she's the other side. That's how we hear it. You can't do a story on abortion or without somebody saying you're either for it or against it.
Right.
Then you're right, you're doing your job if you're doing it right down the middle and you got both sides blaming you. Now, people realize that the media has taken a stance. And so I think the people who are enjoying the media the most right now are those who are anti-Trump, because that's what they're hearing mostly, except on Fox. Fox is probably has the highest ratings, because the people who are in favor of Trump listen only to that.
Yeah.
And so after Trump leaves office, either in 2020 or 2024, whenever he leaves, the news media is going to be sitting there trying to recover its credibility and say, we're objective, we're right down the middle, we let you decide. And I don't think it's going to take generations.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, the generations that we would count on to recover our credibility aren't even watching the news.
Exactly. They're getting their news on social media. They're getting their news, on various websites.
And from each other.
And from each other. And it's so difficult now for any consumer of news to know whom to trust.
Right.
Where do you get your news? There's this wonderful website, and I actually have met the founder, and I'm going to ask him to be on the podcast. the website is called All Sides. And what they do is they will take a headline, they will take whatever the story of the day is, and they will publish next to each other the article from the left point of view, the article from the right point of view, and the article that is most in the center. And you can tell just by looking at the headlines. If you didn't know, you could just read the headline and you could figure out which news organization this article is related to. It's fascinating. Yeah. It's absolutely fascinating. And I love the concept of that site because the consumer can then look at it and say, okay, this is how they told the story, this is how they told the story, this is how they told the story. And they can see where facts may or may not intersect, and it helps you become a more educated consumer of the medium, which is where I think we're going to have to go in order to get back to being able to talk to each other even.
Yeah. And as far as the media ever regaining trust with people, I just don't know that it's ever going to happen again. I think people's antenna is up.
Yeah.
Are they're listening, watching, and sensing what everybody's saying and how they're saying it, where they're coming from, looking for their point of view to be expressed.
Right.
And that's how we discern facts today, not based on when the news media actually gave us facts. Hence the fake news moniker has come up, you know.
And so if we get to that point where we, the media, have no credibility, what does that mean for our democracy?
That's the problem.
What does that mean for our democracy going forward? Because the Fourth Estate is a critical component of how our founders conceived of this great experiment called America. What does that mean for us going forward?
I think it's not good.
No.
It's not good. I mean, our job, as you pointed out earlier, is to monitor government and to make sure that we hold them accountable. Look at Watergate, good example of that. But now, the news media in general has decided that the Trump administration and this president is the most important issue facing this country today. So all they do is focus on all the negative and none of the positive. And you know, there have been some positives in this administration, but we don't hear about those unless you go to the one network that defends this president. So after he's gone, everybody, you know, we're still going to have a president, whoever the next one is, that half the people like and half the people don't. It's always been that way, you know. But they're going to be at a loss as to whom to believe.
Right.
Where are the facts? Yeah. Who's being honest? Who's being truthful and factual? I don't know that we ever regain it.
You know, one of the reasons that I decided to do this particular podcast on this subject, trying to help return civility and respect to the dialogue that we have with each other, is because I was starting to feel hopeless just watching how things began to unravel and the divide got, you know, ever wider. And I started thinking, okay, so what can be, what is the nucleus of the answer to this challenge? And to me, it's about understanding each other as human beings, getting back to the core of what makes us human. We all want ostensibly the same thing. We want to have a certain quality of life. We want to stay healthy long enough to enjoy the things that we love doing. We want to leave the world a better place for our children if we're fortunate enough to have them. You know, that's kind of what we all want. Everybody wants to have some kind of quality of life. So, but we're all different, and we all bring different things to the table, and we all have different stories, and that's why I wanted to have a place where we can have conversations like the one that we're having right now, where, you know, someone who might be prejudiced against Hispanics or against African Americans is out there watching and listening to the two of us having this conversation. And maybe by hearing something that we're saying, it strikes a chord in them to say, maybe I was wrong about Hispanics, or maybe I was wrong about, all African Americans aren't, on welfare and living in, whatever that preconceived idea is. But if we start to talk to each other as human beings and be vulnerable and open enough to share our stories, like some of what you're sharing here today, what it was like for you as a young reporter, trying to get into a business where there was no one who looked like you, literally. You were a trailblazer. So by sharing those stories, maybe that's where we have to start. So while we're doing all the other things that there's so many people that are working right now trying to bring this divide together in various ways, including policy, including other things, I focus on the human level, and I think that's where we have to start.
I remember you enunciating that when I interviewed you in our 70th anniversary a few months ago. And I remember thinking when you said that it would take a lot of work. And I'm sitting here today not offering you much hope. I realize that. I think we are going to have to depend on the kind of leadership that believes we can come together. And I'm talking about at all levels of government, from the president on down, that offers that hope and brings people back together. Today, that's not going to happen because, admittedly, this presidency is divisive. It's divided us. It's driven us farther apart, and it highlights our differences instead of our sameness. So it's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not going to happen with this administration, because when the problem with always thinking you're right and that you know all the answers is you can't learn anything.
Right.
And this president isn't open to that. And looking at the previous presidency, I think that there were great opportunities there. And President Obama was probably one of the most intellectual, enlightened, great guys this country's ever had. I would love to meet him and talk to him. But there was hope for that at that time. But he really only united one half of the country. The other half was sitting there waiting for Trump. And do those two sides ever come together? So let's say that you and I meet on the street, just as we are, who we are. An elderly Hispanic man.
Take that word out of your vocabulary, Bill.
We want to find common ground. The first thing we're going to do is feel each other out based on the times we're living in, to see if there's going to be any common ground. And if there is, but we're not the ones who really need to come together. How do you make two people who have fundamentally different ideas philosophically about everything come together? I think it has to be enlightened leadership, and one day we may get it.
Yeah.
But it has to start there, because I don't know that we can do it on our own.
Well, I've actually heard people talk about or say out loud that they think we're headed toward another civil war.
I've heard that too.
I can't even imagine.
Well, there are two kinds of wars. There's the violent ones and the cold ones. We're in a cold war.
We're in a cold one now, yeah.
We are in a cold war. The question is, do we ever come out of it?
Yeah.
My conversation with Bill Balleza continues next week with his poignant memories of serving in an unpopular war and the challenge of returning home to a country that viewed Viet Nam veterans as the other. I'm a firm believer that if we can find a way to better understand each other's experiences, we can find a way to respect and accept each other for who we are, even when we don't agree. That's the ultimate goal of this podcast. So with that in mind, what do you want the world to know about your story? How might your story, your truth, provide a different, important perspective and help bridge our divides? If you'd like to share your story with us and have a chance to be on the podcast, all you have to do is go to our website, ourvoicesmatterpodcast.com, and click on What's Your Story? We can't wait to hear from you because your voice matters.